Big problems need big problem solvers. Kevin Kaylakie's guest this episode is that problem solver. Yash Sabharwal is the CEO of CherryCircle Software and a serial entrepreneur. His current focus is creating software solutions for the life sciences industry that can speed up the development of potentially life-saving therapies while driving down costs at the same time. And as you will hear, Yash is focused on not just investment return, but also a better future for patients and their families.
Yash, thank you so much for spending some time this afternoon with me on the podcast, Uncorrelated Minds. There's long history between us. We've known each other for quite some time. And I'm excited to have you tell not just the story of, QBD vision, but also your story and how you came to the point, as we were just talking about before the podcast, that you wanted to tackle this big problem. So I'll start off just the overall kind of vision of QDB vision, if we can say that, is solving biotech's biggest digital challenges. So before we jump into that, go ahead and let's start. The day you finished your doctoral program, you went straight into the startup world. So would you do that again, knowing what you know now?
The short answer is yes. It's funny because I went to do my PhD for a very specific reason, and that was that there was a broader goal for me. I've always wanted to do entrepreneurship, and I felt that going and getting my PhD was going to be important in order to do that. One would say, well, why? There's no, you're not learning anything about business or finance or anything like that. But I would say that one of the things you learn when you go and do your PhD is how to solve complex problems, very complex problems. How do you take something that hasn't been done before, you want to go solve it, and how do you deconstruct that into smaller problems, which you can then kind of, reassemble back into the solution of the big problem. So that was a natural progression in my career objective, which was to go into entrepreneurship. It's funny because at the time, this was the late 90s. I was coming out of the optics program. At the time, optical engineers were in very high demand because it was the dot-com boom. Fiber optic, fiber telecommunications, fiber optics were being laid all over the place. You had companies like Lucent and Nortel that were hiring like crazy, hiring a lot of my graduate student colleagues who were getting very big salaries and bonuses on top of that. And here I was deciding that I was going to, sleep in my futon next to my desk and try to start a company. But ultimately, it worked out quite well for me. And I realized in that whole experience that the process of building a company can be very fulfilling because you're going after problems that other people haven't solved, and solving those big problems is what really ends up, driving me. And so the short answer is yes. I have no regrets around doing that. And, doing it also when you don't have a family, you're young, you're single. The only thing you have to lose is whatever little bit you have, and you can, get back up on your feet and brush yourself off and go do what you were going to do anyway. If that's what it was going to be. It was a lower risk proposition at the time, so it worked out. Yeah, it was a great experience. Certainly set me up for the rest of my entrepreneurial career, and I have no regrets around that.
Well, good. I know there's exits and then there's exits when you have a company, but I always marvel at any entrepreneur who has a successful exit and a single one. But you're now working on your third company and two previous exits from companies that I would say were in the successful bucket. So tell me about, what you did with the first company and how that transitioned into the second company. And now, I've never called you Dr. Sabharwal before, but Dr. Sabharwal is the CEO of a software company with a PhD in optics. So how do you go from that point A to whatever point we're at here which I think is probably mid-alphabet for you. It's definitely not Z.
Well, it's interesting. We've talked about this before, I think, and I've talked about this with other people where, for me, the concept of reinvention is an important one. For me personally, as a personal objective, reinventing myself is something that I like to do periodically, and it's incredibly fulfilling and humbling. So, coming out of my PhD program, I was, ready to be a great optical engineer. I could have gone and worked at any one of these companies and tackled some of the problems that they were working on. But I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so that meant taking a step back and being in a position where I'm doing something that I don't know how to do. I understand the technical aspects of what we were doing as a company, but the business aspects were quite foreign to me and my colleagues as well. I started that company with two other students that came out of graduate school with me. And so we were trying to figure it out along the way. And there's, it's sort of that adventure explorer kind of personality where you're trekking down a path that you don't know where it's leading exactly. But there's a lot of sort of excitement and fulfillment in doing that while you're in the process of trying to solve this problem. And it's not to say that it was easy. I mean, there were many times where we came close to just, calling it quits and saying, let's just go and, make some reasonable money. And why are we doing this to ourselves? Right. But of course we kept going and then we were able to, ultimately grow the company and be acquired. And that was incredibly fulfilling to have that first exit after 8 years of sort of struggling and slogging away at doing something we didn't know how to do. And at that point I realized after we had exited that, probably the next thing I was going to do was not going to involve optics. So, optics was my education. It was the crux of what we did as a company, but it was time to, move on to something else. And so I took some time off at that point, met my future wife in Arizona. She, Jessica brought me back here to Austin. And it was great because I knew Austin was a hotbed of entrepreneurial activity, something I had been wanting to explore for a while coming to Austin. So it fit from a career perspective. And, lo and behold, 6 months later, I got an opportunity to join a pharmaceutical company. And so here I was again, reinventing myself because I didn't know anything about the pharmaceutical business. I did know now how to start and build a company from nothing. So I had that experience, but I didn't have any experience in the business. So it was an opposite situation of what I had before, where I understood the technical material, didn't know anything about how to build a business. Now I was knowing how to build a business, but not knowing anything about what we were doing as a company. Again, a very fun and exciting opportunity, but it was also solving a big problem again. Here we have a population of people with diabetes, around the world. One of the challenges of being a person with diabetes is that you can have severe hypoglycemia. And at that time, the only way you could treat severe hypoglycemia. So now you're past a point where you can just eat something or drink some juice to get your sugar back up. You are at a point where you may be having a seizure. You're not sure what's happening. You may be in a coma. And it's a very serious situation. And the only products that were available were powders of sort of powdered vials of glucagon that somebody would have to mix with water at that time and then inject that into you, right? So the challenge, of course, is that in the middle of an emergency like that, the person that's probably around is not a medical professional, right? And so the likelihood was that somebody was just going to call 911, and so there you are, still with low sugar, very low sugar, potentially a life-threatening situation, and you're waiting 10, 15 minutes for the ambulance to show up when somebody could have injected you with this. But the product presentation was so difficult that nobody knew how to do it, and they wouldn't do it, right? So this technology that Xeris Pharmaceuticals, which is the company that was I was joining, the technology they had developed was a very interesting formulation technology that got rid of that problem. It essentially allowed you to create an EpiPen style injectable drug that you could just take the cap off and push it into somebody, and it would deliver the drug that's already mixed for you. And, that has a considerable impact on the propensity to save somebody's life in an emergency situation like that. And so when anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people die a year from this situation, it was a pretty interesting problem to go after. And so that was a great opportunity. I learned a lot about the pharmaceutical business, got to, learn about how drugs are developed, how they're ultimately, approved by the FDA and marketed and so forth. But I also discovered another problem in that scenario, going through that experience, which was, as we were trying to figure out how to scale up the production of this drug for manufacturing in larger volumes, I realized that the industry was still utilizing pretty antiquated software tools, essentially, Microsoft Word and Excel and PowerPoint, emails, you name it, right? Just documents, reports. The way in which information was managed over the life cycle of the development process made it very difficult to make good decisions, to use your data, to see in a holistic way what was happening with your program, and then be able to prioritize appropriately, what you needed to do and when you needed to do it. So when I left Xeris in 2016, the new management team was coming in to take the company public. Xeris is now a public company today. And actually that product that we started with is now an approved product on the market that people can use to save the lives of those who are in a very difficult situation with severe hypoglycemia. So that's, an incredibly fulfilling thing to see happen, where the project you were working on, over an 8-year span now is an approved product, available for people with diabetes. When I left in 2016, I decided that, after I took a few months off, that I was going to go after this problem now. How do you do a better job of capturing and managing and using the information that's being generated across multiple departments, across multiple disciplines, and then utilize that information to go faster, right? So here I was again starting over, right? This is the theme of reinvention comes back again, right? So started a business, then I went into pharmaceuticals. Now I have a background in the pharmaceutical problem, 2 iterations of starting a business, but now it's a cloud-based software solution, which I've never, worked on before.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you would, reading through all of the company literature, if you are not in the pharma industry, it is maybe actually literally Greek, some of it, but you read through it, there's a lot of very complex problems that are being solved by what you're doing, but you have a wonderful analogy. And when you gave the analogy of baking the cake, it really hit home for all of those that were kind of looking at your company at a high level. It's like, wow, that is actually a big problem. And understanding really what the FDA wants out of a drug development process. I had no idea before I met you as you were tackling this problem. I met you before, but as you started tackling this problem, really just if you could tell our listeners that, what is the problem? What is that big problem you're solving? And if you could use the analogy, I think that's going to hit home the most.
Yeah, absolutely. So most people think about drug development from the clinical side. So how safe is the drug? Does it provide is it efficacious for treatment as it's intended to be? And we've seen a lot of this conversation over the past couple of years with the pandemic, right? The discussions around vaccines and are they safe? Do they work? If they do work, how do they work? What are we actually saying they're good at doing? Most of the focus tends to be on the clinical side. There is less focus from a commercial perspective or the commercial view, if you will, on the manufacturing side. And so this is where we get to this discussion of baking cakes. And the idea here is that, if you were to start your own cake business and you are small and you're going to make, 10 cakes a week, you can probably do that in your house using your commercial oven, right? Or your home oven. If you now are going to say, well, I'm growing and I need to make 100 cakes a week, well, you can't do that in your house anymore. Not only can you, and not only can you not do it in your house, you need a whole new set of equipment. You need commercial ovens, you need bigger mixers. And the question becomes, well, does my recipe change? How does my recipe change? How do all the things that I do when I'm baking the cake change when I have to go from 10 cakes a week to 100 cakes a week, right? And then, of course, the next problem is now if I have to go to 10,000 cakes a week, what happens, right? Or I have to go to 50,000 cakes a week, what happens then? This is the other side of drug development that most people they're not aware of, right? But the FDA is keenly aware of it. And one of the things that they are very focused on when they think about approving a drug is not only is it safe and efficacious, but can the company manufacture it at the volumes that they are saying they're going to need to manufacture it while maintaining the level of control from a quality perspective that keeps the drug safe. That is, a huge challenge in the industry as you go from making 1,000 syringes, injections to 10,000 to 100,000 to 1 million per batch. And if you think about the level of the number of vaccines that have had to be made, scaling that up in a very rapid way is challenging if you don't have access to all the information that you need to have access to, right? You can hand your cake recipe off to somebody and say, well, this is kind of how I make the cake. And that's great. But when you have to have it in a very controlled fashion and every slice or every cake has to taste exactly the same, have the same moisture, have the same color, have all the things that are required in order for it to be a good quality cake and meet its intended purpose, that's a very challenging thing to do, and to do that quickly. And I think we've seen some of the challenges with that, with the industry, where they've been able to make a certain volume, but certainly not enough to keep pace with what's been needed. And we see that this is a problem across the board, not just for vaccines, it's for anything. It's what takes the industry, it's why it takes so long to get drugs to market as well. We think that problem puts manufacturing on a critical path that slows things down, and it takes longer then for these treatments to get to patients, which just isn't necessary, and it can be remedied, in our opinion. And we think one of the ways to remedy that is to have much better software tools out there, software solutions for the industry. And that's the problem we're trying to solve right now.
Yeah. But I mean, you and I have had a number of conversations about, just I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the rapid development of the COVID-19 vaccines, and really just what a miracle it was that came out and did what it did. And I wouldn't have understood exactly how amazing it was that all of these companies were able to do that unless I had talked to you before about that manufacturing process. So if you could just give the listeners the idea, if you were to develop a vaccine on a normal non-rushed basis, how long would that usually take from an FDA process? And then what did we do? And then really how, what I see, your company doing is really speeding up that time in the production side of the drug, not the clinical side of the drug, but shrinking that time frame from when a drug is created to getting it to market at scale.
Yeah, I think there were two things that happened with the approaches that were taken. So if you think about how vaccines were made 10 years ago, the generally the technology was, let's take the existing virus, let's inactivate it, and let's give it back, let's inject it in you. And then, structurally, the body sees it. The virus can't do anything because it can't infect cells and replicate. But structurally, the key pieces are there for the body to recognize that it's foreign, and then you build your immunity. You prime your immune system that way, right? That approach has been what's used for a long time, and the process of making those cells that way, making the viruses, inactivating them, all that work. Those are complex processes that take a long time to figure out and to actually manufacture the virus. You can't scale them up as quickly as you can with some of the new technologies today. So I think the first big step was the whole idea of the mRNA vaccine, right? So the technologies that were developed by Moderna and BioNTech and others is a game changer, because it's now saying, well, we don't need to figure out how to make the vaccine based on the virus cells themselves. We just need to figure out what are the instructions to have your own body produce the antigen, they call it, so that your body can recognize it, right? That's a very different approach and a very different technology. And the whole impetus for that is it's a lot more specific, and obviously you can scale that a lot faster. If you read some of the articles around the work that was done at UT and other places when the first SARS virus happened about 20 years ago, a lot of those folks figured out back then that this was going to happen again. And there needed to be a series of mechanisms in place and technologies put together to help figure out very quickly when it does happen, what's going on. So by the time it did happen again, all these new technologies were in place in terms of sequencing the virus to figure out exactly what it was, all the imaging technologies to figure out the structures, the protein structures, so on and so forth. Then being able to figure out, then send it to companies like Moderna and say, look, here's what this virus looks like. Here's some possibilities for targeting it, having them run their libraries and their AI algorithms to figure out what is the mRNA sequence that we need to code for. So these were all things that were built up over a couple of decades. And it all was sort of in place when this happened, which gave, it took us to the point where Moderna was able to, within 3 weeks, I think, after they got the sequence, after they got the virus information, they were able to figure out the mRNA sequences, I think, within 3 to 4 weeks and start making those, right? And so that is a game changer. The only thing that we didn't know was that there'd never been a vaccine that had been developed with this technology before. So the big question was, what was the safety profile going to be, and so forth, right? So that was then had to be tested in clinical trials. And so all of that work went really quickly. It was very, relatively speaking, a lot of software information technologies came together to do that. But on the manufacturing side, you were putting a lot of resources to make things go faster, but I wouldn't say that there are more efficient resources in place to do that. And that's the problem we're trying to solve, is to say, okay, when this happens again, and it will happen again at some point, and you need to make a lot of medicines very quickly, you need better information technology solutions in place to drive that efficiency in a way that you can automate a lot of the activities that are still done very manually right now, in terms of demonstrating that level of quality control to the FDA. So that's the path that we're on at this point. But it is no doubt that what you said is absolutely true. What the industry accomplished in the amount of time that they did is an absolute miracle. It was amazing. But there was a lot of work that was done ahead of time to get to that, to make that happen, right?
Yeah. And in essence, on the manufacturing side, ICQDB vision is almost creating a tribal knowledge base in certain drug developments of the processes that made it work quickly, documenting that. So you're not, starting over with your cake every time, right? You're going back to the point in time where, hey, it's a little dry. Maybe I had too much egg and I need to take an egg out. And you're going back to that point instead of going back to starting to mix the flour with the sugar and then coming on through, I think was the example you used. And just full fair disclosure to our listeners, I don't know if more or less eggs dries things out or not. I'm not good in the kitchen. So.
Yeah. And that's a great point as well too, Kevin, because a lot of the new technologies that are coming out, especially in precision medicine, cell and gene therapy, so on and so forth, are platform technologies. So if you think about making a platform cake right? So I have a cake. I know there's flour in it. I know there's sugar in it. There's, water and eggs and milk and all the different ingredients. And actually, if you talk to bakers, they'll tell you there's formulas for all of them. There's very specific ratios for how much fat you should have relative to water or sugar to flour. There's a lot of bakers' percentages that the bakers know that they use, right? So imagine, you're gonna create a platform of making cakes, and sometimes it'll be chocolate, and other time it'll be vanilla. But for the most part, 90% of that information is consistent from one cake recipe to the next, right? So now you can put together the template in a system like ours and dial it in for your first cake. And then when you go to make your next type of cake, you can just kind of copy that, make some slight modifications, because now you're going to add chocolate, or you're going to, make it a German chocolate cake, whatever you want to do. Right. But you're not starting from scratch again. You have a baseline of information that covers 80 to 90% of what you're already going to do. And so that's how you're starting to create those efficiencies in a way that's really, really meaningful for the industry.
I think that all of this stuff is immensely fascinating to me because A, I know very little about it, but B, you are tackling the big problems. And, maybe I could just pivot a bit and just go back and tell the story of when you and I met. I was actually giving a presentation at the Austin Technology Council and ended up sitting next to you. And we started talking, and all of a sudden you throw out the terms, pre-money, post-money, as we're talking about valuations on venture deals. And I was like, okay, I'm going to connect with this guy at a very good level because he knows the business side of the business. Like, you really understood the fundraising. Obviously, they don't teach you venture fundraising in your PhD optics program. They probably didn't really even know what you're doing with your first company. So what is your advice to other people who are really trying to tackle a big problem when it comes to, okay, I'm focused on my problem, but I also need to know and understand the business side of things. How did you learn that? Give us the story of how you learned that and how you've now applied it forward into launching your own company.
Well, the first piece of advice I'd give everybody is take an accounting class. So one of the opportunities I had while I was in the PhD program was that I figured out I could go and take classes at the management school. So this was at University of Arizona. So the Eller School of Management, I could go take classes there, and I could just go take classes there as long as there was an opening for me. I couldn't take the spot of an MBA student, right? So I went over there and I decided to see if there was an accounting class available. And so there was, and I took it. And then I was going to take the finance class, but that was full, so I couldn't do that one. But I took an organizational behavior class, which was also great. It's great for helping figure out how to, manage your personnel and hire people and just the things you should think about. So I was, I guess, a bit entrepreneurial in terms of taking those classes, but having some background in accounting and finance was critical. And where I learned finance ultimately was watching CNBC every day for 10 years. Right? I would get up every morning and watch it. And as you watch it, you start to learn, you see the patterns, you start to recognize, what's happening when there's an M&A, how are they talking about it? All the things around premiums to stock price when somebody gets bought or sold. These are very sort of practical pieces of finance that I picked up on after watching it for a long time. So that was very helpful because at my first company at Optical Insights, I was responsible for the finance piece, and then when I went to Xeris, I was initially the CFO and the COO, and did a lot of the initial work in terms of building the models, the valuation models. It was interesting because in a pharma company or biotech company, you don't generate value by generating revenue in the early days, right? You're not going to see revenue for 10, 12 years. So your path to value creation is by hitting regulatory milestones and then getting development deals done with bigger pharma companies. But still, you have to build the models, justify them, explain to investors what you're doing and how you've discounted it. So the whole idea of discounted cash flow and so forth is important to know. But ultimately, it comes down to, do you understand your business, and can you help somebody understand overall what's the value you're creating, especially when it's a venture capital kind of deal. It's a high risk deal. And I remember one of our angel investors, I went to see him after he hadn't invested yet. We were doing our A round, and he said, so we talked about it for a little while, and then he just kind of looked at me and said, "What's the probability that I'm going to get my money back?"
Very good question.
And so I just kind of folded up my stuff at that point, and I said, it is highly likely that you will not see this money again. I said, there's a pretty good chance that you won't see this money again.
Which is the most honest answer you could have given him.
Right. Right. I said, if we do this right, the multiple will be, is based on the averages. It's pharma multiples tend to be pretty high. So this is a high risk, high return scenario. And you just need to know that going into this, right? This isn't something incremental. Lots of pharma companies don't make it. And there's a lot riding on whether the science works or not. And, the money that we're looking to get from this first round of investors is to help prove out some of that science, right? So yeah, ultimately it comes down to just being honest with people and letting them understand that you can analyze this all day long, but ultimately it's a high risk, high return scenario because there's a lot of technical risk involved with it. It's very different from a conversation I'd have with an investor about CherryCircle Software and the QBD Vision platform, right? There's no technical risk in what we're doing, right? Writing software is not, people know how to write software. We're essentially building databases and connecting information. So the technical risk is kind of off the table. It's really market risk, right? So that's a different scenario. I think that's some of some of the experiences I've had and some of the advice I would give to people. I think the other thing too that's really important, when it comes to fundraising is, tell people what you're going to do and then go do it, right? And show them that you did it. I've had a lot of people tell me that was somehow not something that they see very often, where somebody says, well, I'm going to go do these 3 things the next 6 months. And then they come back in 6 months and they start talking about something else. They don't talk about the 3 things that they said they were going to do and whether they did them or not.
Or even have a story for why you didn't do them. The classic word in startup land is pivot, right? It's if we had to pivot, why did we pivot and what did we pivot towards? And are we having success there? Not just the land of pivots, which we've heard that
right.
many, many times. Well, for our last piece, I think one part that a lot of our listeners would be fascinated to learn about is, as a founder and a startup founder doing something different, is building the culture of your firm and your people, and why that is so important, maybe even more so now than back in the 80s and 90s when you were launching out in the optics world.
Well, I don't know that I'd say it's more important now than it was before. I think culture and the team you build is always critical. And the reason it's so critical is that the world of the startup is highly uncertain, right? So you end up in a situation where you've got a new product. It's never been built before. Something like this has never been developed before. You're trying to figure out how are you going to sell it to people. And a lot of times we've talked about this in the past, a lot of times that people don't see the value of what you're doing or proposing until you actually build it and show it to them, right? So it's hard to get that market validation ahead of time because they can't even conceive of what you're talking about. So being able to, so going and building it and then showing people then they see, oh, wow, I didn't know this was even possible. So you always end up with this situation where there's all kinds of things happening. You're not sure exactly how to, there's no clear path. Like nobody's given you a script that says, hey, just go do this and you'll be successful, right? So when that's the situation, you need to have people around you who are adaptive and they're smart and they're persistent and they have all the things that you need, and they're good at working with their team members, and they're good at helping each other, because some days somebody's down, some days somebody's up, some days somebody's having a great day, some days somebody's crushing it, some days somebody just fell on their face, right? It's a constant stream of activities like that, until you get to a point where you hit that critical mass, you hit that traction, and then it's a little bit more predictable. And in those early unpredictable days, you need a very resilient team of people around you to get through the emotional roller coaster of being an entrepreneur, but also just the trying to figure out, how do you actually do this, right? And that's just so key. I think there's often a discussion that's happened, when you start a company, should you have partners or should you not have partners, right? Some people say, no, I can't do partners. Other people say, I can't do without partners, right? And I'm just one of those people that says, I can't do it without partners, because there's so much that has to happen. I can't see how you would do it without partners. And even if you're the only founder, if you don't treat your rest of your management team like your partners, there's going to be a problem at some point. There's going to be a problem at some point.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
That's almost
100%.
a moot question, whether you do partners or not do partners. You need a team of people to help you go after something big. And so that sets then if you're going to create that team and it's going to be effective over the long run, then that's when the culture piece comes in, right? Setting up an environment where people feel comfortable speaking their mind, right? Not feeling like, or not acting like, you're afraid of hiring people better than you. So, we have this constant discussion that, we say it all the time in our meetings. We're always trying to hire people better than us at the senior management level, right? We want to hire people that will that will speak their mind. There's no penalty, for respectfully disagreeing and saying what you want to say. There's no penalty for going and doing something and failing at it. We'll just talk about it and say, okay, so did that work? Why didn't that work? We don't want to kill people's initiative. And so, because especially at this early stage, all we have is initiative, right? That's all we've got. You got to have sales initiative and development initiative and customer success initiative. And how am I going to do something? Nobody's telling me what to do, but I see that there's a gap, right? And so we've had these conversations across the board, and we bring on interns, and we had one intern we brought on recently, very ambitious young man. He reached out to me and said, I'd like to talk to you. I know you're the CEO, but I'd like to talk to you. Okay, sure. Here's 30 minutes. Let's talk. What do you want? Yeah. What do you want to talk about?
Yeah. Love
right?
the initiative.
And
yeah, go for it.
So we really encourage that. And it's been incredibly impactful for us as an organization. I mean, we do things with our size that most people marvel at because of the initiative that people show and just how talented they are.
Well, I know also when you are tackling big problems, and even tackling small problems, even problems with inside the company or between people, is when you have a group of intelligent people who are willing to disagree with each other and have the ability to disagree with each other, that's where almost the magic happens. That's where the big ideas and the initiatives, where it's like, hey, I want to do this. And then someone says, yeah, I disagree with you, but what about this? And then if you really do have open-minded people who have that ability to disagree, that doesn't become I can't believe he's shooting down my idea, because there's no ladder to climb in the small, like you're not going to take Yash's job, as the founder and CEO of the company yet. And so you're really doing it to improve things. And when everyone gets in that mindset, and everyone is pointing, I see this with many, many startups, is that they build that culture of you disagree because you think something can be done better, and that the outcome for our client is what the end result is of all of it. Every disagreement or every time you're thinking about doing something better is because you want a better outcome for your user, your end user.
Yeah, I mean, the feedback that we get from our engineers or my chief operating officer or even our customer success person or whoever, what ends up happening is that it precipitates a conversation that then always leads to something better. That's what I found, because we all have our biases. We all come in with sometimes very strong biases, and I'm certainly guilty of that. Even if the ideas that have been presented, there's no resolution around that particular disagreement at that point in time, I certainly spent a lot of time thinking about what that other person said, even though I didn't disagree with it. And then I start to see that side of it. And then I think about it more. And then I say, okay, this is my side, that's that side. And I see the benefits of how do we put it together? How do we take the best of both to come back and then you have that better solution? And you can't have that if nobody's willing to stand up and say, I think differently. And so and that's actually the most interesting parts of this is that sort of churn of discussion and feedback that just gives you something better in the end. I really enjoy that aspect of what we do as a company.
Agreed. So last question for you. Hopefully this will wrap things up for the day. We can send you back out to solve big problems in the world instead of chatting on a podcast with me. But you are part of a company, you founded a company that is growing. And as you are moving on to the next stage of growth for the company, what would you say to a potential investor to say, hey, this is the problem we're trying to tackle, and this is why I want you to come along with us as an investor?
Again, we are going after solving a very big problem that ultimately is going to have a big impact for society as a whole. And I firmly believe that. As we move forward, and you think about what's happened the past couple of years, you can see why that matters, to you. It matters to everybody. And I think as investors, for me, at some point when I think about investing in the future, I want to, I feel like a lot of times investors get too caught up in, well, what's the return going to be? Right. And you have to think about, what's the return going to be? Does the risk match the, match the reward and so forth? But ultimately, when you're investing in grand ideas, right, you're investing in something better, right? You're investing in a better state of society, a better way of existing, a better overall experience for all of us as a society and as a species on this earth, in my opinion, right? And so what I want to, when I'm talking to an investor, or if an investor is thinking about what we're doing, I would say to them, if your goal is to increase your return by a certain percentage points, we're probably not the right investment for you. Our focus is on really changing on how things are done. And that means you're changing behavior. And changing behavior is an incredibly difficult thing to do, right? So, but if you change that behavior, that can be very, very meaningful for what happens next. And if that's the journey you want to be on with us, then we would love to have you, because that's all the people that we have surrounded ourselves with, all the people that come to us and work for us are all on that same journey with us. They want to make things, systematically better in a way that could have tremendous impact for all of us. And I encourage all of those people that are interested in that kind of journey to come on that journey with us.
Well, and I'll say this just to wrap it up, your tagline here, solving biotech's biggest digital challenges. I think it's also, in a way, you're solving the challenges that we don't even know we are going to face yet. So by having this in place, you're putting the that programmatic base in place to allow all of the researchers who did the mRNA vaccine research over the last 20 years since the last SARS. You're building a digital platform, so when the next thing rolls around, we can move quickly and solve problems for humanity and not just for an investor. So
yeah, and that's certainly the goal, right? That's absolutely the goal. So I really appreciated the conversation today, Kevin.
You bet.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's always fun to talk about the journey at times, and the good and the bad and the ugly, of course, and but it's incredibly rewarding to build companies and to go after big problems and to work with people who uplift me every day. I mean, my team, they're an incredible group of people. They're also just really good human beings, and there's no way I could do this without these folks. So we're all in this together, and it's a lot of fun.
Well, Yash, thanks for coming on. And, I think I look forward to joining you in an entrepreneurs therapy group in the near future, if possible. So that'd be a lot of fun. Thanks for coming, Yash.
Thank you for listening to the Uncorrelated Minds podcast. Click the follow button below to be notified when new episodes become available. For more information on the topics covered in this podcast, please visit the show notes page for links to further information at www.sinaceracapital.com. Sinacera Capital, LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Sinacera and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.